Welcome to Shocking Crime Story. Tonight's story is about the serial killers, but not the ones you already know. Not the ones with documentaries with nicknames or prison records. These serial killers were never identified. They were never caught on camera. No clear faces, no names, no arrests. And the police believe some of the serial killers are still alive. That is not speculation. That is not a rumor. That is the official position attached to multiple open homicide investigations around the world. Between 2001 and 2020, dozens of people were murdered across 4 continents. Drivers finishing late shifts, children walking familiar routes, women heading home, sex workers meeting clients, dog walkers stepping outside for air, ordinary civilians doing ordinary things. They disappeared into evenings that were supposed to be routine, and they never came back. What makes these cases different is not only the brutality, it is the absence. Most serial killers, no usable faces, no consistent suspect descriptions, no arrests were made, no convictions that lasted. Despite modern policing, despite CCTV networks, digital forensics, phone tracking, license plate readers, DNA databases, and eyewitness canvassing, nothing stuck. Every system that should have worked didn't when it comes to these serial killers. And that is why these serial killers are still out there. Most people believe serial killers are relics of the past, products of an era before cameras, before databases, before the internet made anonymity impossible. You are told that today, it is too hard to disappear, too hard to kill repeatedly without leaving a trail, too hard to move unseen. These cases prove the opposite. Serial killers reveal a pattern so consistent, it feels intentional. I guess it's their hobby. In terms of serial killers, each investigation began the same way. A missing person, a body found, a crime scene documented with precision. Officers secured perimeters. Detectives pulled footage. Analysts interviewed witnesses. Forensic teams processed what they could. And yet, when the dust settled, what remained was not a suspect, but a void. Surveillance failed. Trust me, I think serial killers are trained to hide faces. Cameras existed, but they captured nothing useful. Angles were wrong. Lighting was poor. Faces were obscured by hats, shadows, distance, or timing. Footage showed movement, but never identity. A figure passing through a frame. A silhouette crossing a lot. A shape entering darkness and never emerging clearly enough to name. Witness descriptions conflicted. One person saw a tall man. Another remembered someone average in height. Some recalled an older face. Others insisted the suspected serial killer looked young. Clothing colors changed from account to account. Hair length varied. Serial killers' accents disappeared when repeated. No description aligned cleanly enough to build a profile investigators could trust. Suspected serial killers vanished. People of interest were questioned, then released. The leads went cold. Tips contradicted each other. DNA, when recovered, didn't match anything in national databases. Phone records dead-ended. Vehicles were never identified with certainty. In some cases, even the direction of escape was unclear. And none of these serial killers went to prison. Not for these crimes. Not under these names. Not with these victims attached. The result of categories of serial killers that law enforcement rarely speaks about publicly, the unidentified serial offender. Not suspected. Not charged. Not named. Just present. Lingering in open files and internal reports. A human being who committed multiple murders and was never conclusively seen. Could it be for revenge or for fun? You don't need answers because you are not a serial killers. That is the reality you are stepping into. This documentary is not about famous monsters. It is not about killers whose faces you already know. It is about the serial killers who left no face at all who might be living in your neighborhood. You better lock your doors. As you listen, you will hear about bodies posed with intention, not dumped, but arranged, as if placement mattered. You will hear about organs missing, not randomly, but selectively. You will hear about markings left behind, symbols or patterns that investigators struggled to interpret, unsure whether they were ritualistic, taunting, or simply personal. You will hear about serial killers who adapted. When patrols increased, serial killers shifted locations. When cameras were installed, serial killers altered routes. When patterns were noticed, serial killers changed methods. And when the risk grew too high, some of these serial killers simply stopped. That is what unsettles investigators the most. Because stopping does not mean being caught. They might start again. In many of these cases, the timeline ends abruptly. Murders occur over months or years, then vanish from record. No final confrontation. No arrest announcement. No closure press conference. Just silence. And silence can mean many things. It can mean death. It can mean incarceration for something else. Or it can mean something far more disturbing. It can mean success. To understand how this happens, you have to understand the conditions that allowed it. Most of these crimes or killings by these serial killers occurred during the same narrow window of time, between 7:30 p.m. and late night. That is when the world softens. When light fades. When routines overlap with isolation. When witnesses are fewer, attention is divided, and memory becomes unreliable. Serial killers' victims were often alone. They were moving through familiar paths. They were doing things they had done before. Nothing about the moment felt dangerous until it was. Police descriptions of the suspected serial killers shared another chilling similarity. They were forgettable. Average height. Average build. Unremarkable clothing. Nothing distinctive enough to remember twice. These were not figures who drew attention. Serial killers, they did not stand out in crowds. They did not behave erratically in public. They blended. They passed. They disappeared back into environments that did not notice them leaving. The perfect killers are not monsters. They are invisible. And invisibility is not accidental. Across 4 continents, across cultures and cities that share nothing else in common, the same investigative frustrations repeat. Serial killers with the same phrases appear in reports. The same uncertainties surface in interviews. Detectives say things like, "We believe the suspect knew the area," or "the offender showed awareness of surveillance," or "this individual likely lived a normal life outside the crimes." Normal. That word appears again and again. It suggests someone who went to work, someone who had neighbors, someone who knew how to appear harmless, someone who understood how to move through public spaces without being remembered, someone who understood you. That is the central question this serial killer's case leaves you with. Are these serial killers hiding, actively avoiding detection, watching systems, adjusting behavior? Or are they living normal lives among us, no longer killing, no longer hunted, no longer suspected? Because if they were never identified, if they were never caught on camera, if no clear faces, no names, no arrests exist, then the story is not over. It is unresolved. And unresolved does not mean past. It means open. It means that somewhere, right now, a person who once committed multiple murders may be walking through a city unnoticed, passing cameras that do not flag them, standing in lines, making small talk, aging quietly. You cannot recognize someone who was never seen. And that is what makes these cases different. That is what makes them terrifying. These serial killers are still out there. And as long as they remain unidentified, the possibility remains that they could strike again. The story does not continue in daylight. It moves into the hours where certainty weakens. One truth is already clear. These serial killers were not stopped by technology or manpower. So the question becomes how? How did so many murders occur in an era saturated with cameras, phones, witnesses, and data? The answer begins with time. Most of these murders happened within the same narrow window, between 7:30 p.m. and late night. Not midnight, not dawn, but the hours when people are still moving, yet no longer fully alert. When streets are active but poorly lit. When businesses are closing, shifts are ending, routines are repeating. This is the hour where shadows start to win. Visibility drops first. Streetlights flicker on unevenly. Headlights glare instead of illuminate. Camera sensors struggle with contrast. Grain replaces clarity. Motion blurs faces just enough to make them unusable. What should be evidence becomes suggestion. Witness reliability follows. At night, distance lies. Height becomes guesswork. Clothing colors shift. Faces flatten. People remember shapes, not details. And when investigators compare statements, they don't line up. Not because witnesses are lying, but because the environment itself distorted what they saw. Victims were often alone. They were vulnerable, but not reckless. They were moving through routine paths, the same walk home, the same dock, the same rest stop, the same shortcut they had taken dozens of times before. Nothing about the moment felt wrong. That is the trap. These serial killers did not create chaos. They exploited normalcy. They waited for predictability. They understood that routine is invisible until it's broken. Police descriptions across cases revealed something deeply unsettling. The suspected serial killers were not memorable. These serial killers were not described as threatening, aggressive, or strange. Instead, reports used the same language again and again. Average height, average build, unremarkable face, sometimes tall, nothing distinctive. No scars, no striking features, no unusual clothing, nothing a witness could anchor their memory to. And that leads to the central realization of these serial killers. The most dangerous serial killers aren't terrifying. They're forgettable. Are they on the loose, or change profession, or many change strategies of killing? This pattern becomes impossible to ignore once the cases are examined closely. So let's talk about serial killers that could technically kill you. The Lake St. Clair Whisperer Serial Killers US. The scene shifted to 2004 to 2010. Killer named because his victims are close to the lake, all were by shore. The first body was found near the shoreline just after dusk. Then another. Then another. Over 5 years, 13 women were discovered along Lake St. Clair, their bodies positioned in the same deliberate way, laid down, facing the ground, as if aligned to something only the serial killers understood. Who knows how many of his victims got drawn or thrown into the lake? The victims varied in age and background, but the pattern did not. Each disappearance occurred in the evening and early in the morning. Each body appeared near water-accessible areas, marinas, shoreline paths, places that felt public enough to be safe, yet isolated enough to go unnoticed in the dark. Witnesses came forward. Several locals reported seeing the serial killer, a man near marinas around 8 p.m. He was described consistently, but vaguely, approximately 175 centimeters tall, estimated to be around 50 years old at the time. He did not linger. He did not draw attention. He blended into the environment. Another man near the water at night. CCTV footage existed. That was the most frustrating part. Cameras captured movement. A figure walking, a person entering frame, a silhouette near the docks. But the footage never delivered a usable face. Angles were wrong. Lighting failed. The suspect's head dipped at the wrong moment. Shadows crossed at exactly the wrong time. Every clip raised hope, and then erased it. The case grew more disturbing when 2 similar victims were found in Cleveland, hundreds of miles away. Same victim profile, same body positioning, same time window. That distance suggested mobility. It suggested planning. If not the same serial killers, then it suggested the killer was comfortable traveling, crossing jurisdictions, exploiting gaps between agencies. Investigators considered interstate connections, but nothing firm emerged. No arrest followed. No name surfaced. Just a pattern, silence, and fear. If there is something I can say about serial killers, I would say they are posses or maybe just doing this for fun, and this bring notice to the Winnipeg Long-Haul Butcher in Canada, 2011. If the Lake St. Clair case was defined by water, this one was defined by asphalt. Between 2011 and 2016, 6 truck drivers vanished along routes passing through and around Winnipeg. These were experienced drivers, men familiar with long nights, rest stops, and industrial roads. They were not reckless. They were cautious by necessity. Each disappearance happened during evening hours. Fuel stops, mandatory breaks, quiet industrial zones where trucks idle and engines cool. The bodies, when recovered, were found near rest stops and service roads, places invisible to the public eye but familiar to anyone who works long-haul routes. If you are a truck driver, you'd be scared now. Investigators struggled to understand the motive. One theory suggested personal hatred toward truck drivers. Another proposed something more chilling. The serial killer is deeply familiar with transport routes, schedules, and blind spots. Someone who knew when trucks would stop, where drivers would be alone, and how long it would take before anyone noticed. One victim, Mark Holloway, 42, was last seen fueling his rig at 7:47 p.m. Security cameras recorded him swiping his card, checking his tires, and walking toward the rest area. He never returned. No suspect vehicle was confirmed. No clear footage of an encounter was recovered. Phone records ended abruptly. The serial killer disappearance folded neatly into the night. Despite years of investigation, no suspect was ever confirmed. The killer moved through industrial darkness like it was designed for him. There are also other serial killer cases around the world named as Concrete Widow St. Petersburg, in Russia, between 2007 to 2012. In St. Petersburg, the night swallowed sound. Over a 5-year span, 4 women vanished after evening shifts. They were last seen leaving work sites, transit stops, or familiar routes home. Days later, their bodies were discovered inside an abandoned construction site. Not dumped, hidden. The killer used the structure itself: unfinished floors, concrete slabs, industrial debris. Bodies were concealed between layers of the building, as if the site was chosen specifically to erase them from sight. Does this make you wondering if these serial killers lure his victims to such places? You are wondering what he does with them and why. Security guards reported something strange. On multiple nights, they heard footsteps echoing through the unfinished structure after hours. The sounds were slow, deliberate, not hurried. When guards investigated, they found nothing. Cameras inside the site had been disabled. Whether this was sabotage or neglect was never fully determined. What mattered was the result. No footage, no timeline, no face. The construction site became a grave and a blind spot. Again, no arrest followed. Across these cases, the same realization settles in. This was not luck. These serial killers understood the environment. They understood how night changes perception, how routine creates predictability, how forgettable appearances erase memory. They did not overpower systems, they slipped between them. Each case feels isolated at first. Different countries, different victims, different methods. But when viewed together, the pattern becomes undeniable. These serial killers didn't hide from the night. They used it. And as these cases ends, one truth becomes unavoidable. What initially looked like coincidence is beginning to look like design. When fear took a shape, what began as invisibility is no longer subtle. What once looked like coincidence now feels intentional. And the violence, once quiet, restrained, almost clinical, has escalated into something heavier. This is the moment where fear stops being abstract. This is where it takes a shape. Across continents, the patterns you've already seen begin to harden. These serial killers do not simply strike and vanish anymore. They mutilate. They remove. They leave behind questions that refuse to stay contained inside police files. Communities begin whispering names. Faces are imagined. Suspects emerge, not from evidence, but from desperation. And yet, even here, justice slips away. This brings us to the serial killers named the Shadow Butcher, in Nigeria, between 2013 to 2018. The killings did not start loudly. They spread quietly, through fear. The serial killer Shadow Butcher is more cruel than you think, and this will leave you in shock. Between 2013 and 2018, 16 victims were found across multiple regions. At first, the cases appeared unrelated. Different neighborhoods, different dates, different circumstances. But then investigators noticed what was missing. Vital organs, not randomly damaged, not destroyed by animals or decay, removed, cleanly, deliberately. The precision suggested knowledge, either medical, ritualistic, or practiced through repetition. The bodies told a story investigators didn't want to hear. This wasn't panic violence. This was controlled. Rumors spread faster than official statements. Locals began connecting dots long before authorities did. A name surfaced again and again in hushed conversations: Baba J. No one knew his real name. No one could describe him clearly. But people believed he existed. They believed he moved at night. They believed he watched before he acted. And they believed he took something from his victims that was never meant to be returned. Eventually, the police acted. A man identified by locals as Baba J was arrested. For the first time in years, there was relief. Mothers slept easier. Doors stayed unlocked a little longer. People believed the nightmare was ending. Then Baba J escaped custody. How it happened remains unclear. Records are incomplete. Explanations conflict. What matters is the result. This serial killer vanished. And something even more unsettling followed. After his escape, the killings stopped. No more bodies. No more missing organs. No more confirmed cases. But the fear did not fade. It deepened. Because people were left with a question no one could answer. Was Baba J dead? Or was he finished? In some communities, parents stopped letting children walk alone after sunset. In others, residents claimed to see figures at night. Men who resembled no one specific and everyone at once. Ordinary silhouettes that could never be confirmed, only remembered. The idea that a serial killer might simply decide to stop is more terrifying than capture. It means the power was always his. Technically, you have to be scared of the shadow butcher. But let's talk about some of these serial killers in Asia and how they operate and how dangerous they are. Believe me, this will shock you. The headless serial killer. The serial killer is named after much investigator noticed how they play with their victims. You might want to be scared of the serial killer in India, 2010 to 2015, or you might end up headless. If the shadow butcher represented control, the headless serial killer represented symbolism. Between 2010 and 2015, 7 victims vanished in different regions of India. Each disappearance occurred during the same quiet window, after evening prayers, during short walks, along familiar paths. These were moments people trusted. When the bodies were found, they were incomplete, heads severed, not hacked, not chaotic, removed with intention. At several scenes, investigators discovered markings drawn on floors, symbols that did not immediately match any known group or practice. Some were geometric, others appeared ritualistic. None could be conclusively linked to a specific ideology, cult, or organization. Speculation exploded. Underground rituals, secret societies, copycat killings. Investigators explored every theory, but evidence refused to cooperate. No group claimed responsibility. No suspect was arrested. No motive was confirmed. The absence of answers made the symbols feel heavier. Were they messages? Warnings? Or simply expressions of a private belief system that died with the victims? What disturbed detectives most was the consistency. These were not crimes of opportunity. They were acts performed with preparation, timing, and repetition. The killer, or serial killers, understood the cultural rhythms of the areas they targeted. They knew when people would be alone, when witnesses would be scarce, and when disappearance would not immediately trigger alarm. Again, after several years, have the killings stopped? Not with resolution, not with closure, just silence. And once more, the question rose uncomfortably to the surface. Did the killer fail, or did they succeed? As these cases piled up, something became impossible to ignore. These serial killers were no longer just invisible. They were becoming deliberate in ways that felt almost confident. They removed organs. They staged bodies. They left symbols. And in some cases, these serial killers were nearly identified, nearly named, only to dissolve back into uncertainty at the last moment. That alone would be enough to haunt investigators. But the story does not stop there. Because in one case, the violence took a final, deeply unsettling turn. Such as the Harmony-faced gunman. This serial killer was named after his skill in gunfire and the location of the crime in Thailand. Between 2006 and 2014, up to 9 victims were killed in Thailand. Most were identified as Kat Hoi, transgender women. The method was chilling in its simplicity. They were shot. Execution style. No prolonged struggle. No mutilation. No symbolic staging. Just controlled gunfire, delivered calmly, decisively, and without hesitation. Witnesses came forward quickly in this case, more quickly than in others. Several described the suspected serial killers with the same unsettling details: calm demeanor, a symmetrical, almost gentle facial structure. Nothing aggressive, nothing alarming. One witness said the man looked peaceful. CCTV footage captured movement in multiple locations. A figure entering and exiting frames. A person walking away after shots were fired. But again, the face never appeared clearly. The footage was either too distant, too dark, or obstructed at the crucial moment. Technically, most Asians look alike. How can you easily differentiate them? Well, we can talk about that another day. Despite the scale of the violence, despite the number of victims, the suspect was never identified. No arrest, no public explanation, no confirmed death, just an abrupt end. Investigators were left staring at timelines that simply ended. This sudden silence created a chilling possibility that echoed across all the cases you've heard so far. What if these serial killers weren't stopped? What if they chose to stop? Across the world, across years of investigation, brutality, and fear, the pattern is no longer just about invisibility. It is about agency. These serial killers acted when they wanted to. They escalated when they felt confident. They disappeared when the risk shifted. And now, the question you are left with carries unbearable weight. Did these killers stop, or did they succeed? Have they changed professions? Or they are probably living with us in our neighborhood? Because if they succeeded, then the most frightening truth of all begins to take shape. Some serial killers don't get caught. They walk away. By now, you've seen the pattern form, fracture, and reform across continents and years. You've watched investigations surge with momentum, only to stall without answers. You felt the escalation, the brutality, the confidence, the near identifications that dissolved at the last second. Now comes the most unsettling part concerning serial killers. Not the violence, not the mystery, but the ending that never arrives. Believe me, some of these serial killers have never stopped at all. They are still active. Across all of these cases, investigators eventually noticed something deeply disturbing, not in what the killers did, but in what they stopped doing. The murders didn't always end with arrests. They didn't always end with bodies found years later. In many cases, they simply ended. Timelines went quiet. Scenes that once demanded weekly briefings stopped generating reports. Task forces were quietly downsized. Files were transferred to cold case units. Detectives rotated out. Witnesses aged. Leads expired. And yet, no resolution appeared. When investigators compared these cases across borders, languages, and legal systems, they began to recognize a shared possibility, one that law enforcement rarely states out loud. These serial killers adapted. They changed locations when attention increased. Serial killers always changed methods when patterns were noticed. They adjusted timing when patrols shifted. And sometimes, they simply stopped. That silence suggests three possibilities. The first is death. That some of these killers died, naturally, accidentally, or violently, before they could be identified. It's possible, but in many cases, there was no corroborating evidence. No matching timelines. No closure. The second possibility is incarceration for unrelated crimes. That a killer was arrested for something else, assault, theft, fraud, and disappeared into the system under a different label, never connected to the murders they committed. This, too, happens. But again, not consistently enough to explain every case. Which leads to the third possibility, the one investigators find hardest to accept: successful reintegration into society. The idea that a serial killer might simply age out of violence. That they might decide the risk is no longer worth it. That they could stop not because they were caught, but because they were done. This possibility reframes everything. It suggests that some killers don't get caught. They don't die in confrontations. They don't confess. They retire. They grow older. They change jobs. They move neighborhoods. They become invisible again, not because they're hiding, but because they're no longer being looked for. This is where the case of the Harmony-faced gunman returns, not as an anomaly, but as a warning. Up to 10 victims. A calm demeanor. A gentle, symmetrical appearance. Witnesses remembered how unthreatening he seemed. How nothing about him triggered alarm. CCTV footage captured him moving through public spaces, never rushed, never panicked. Just another person passing through the night. And then, suddenly, the killing stopped. No arrest followed. No public explanation was given. No confirmation of death was ever released. The gunman did not escalate. He did not return. He simply disappeared. Which raises a question that chills investigators more than any unsolved crime scene. What if he didn't disappear at all? What if he just went back to living? Because if that is true, if even one of these killers walked away untouched, then the systems designed to protect people didn't just fail once. They failed completely. Tonight, somewhere in the world, a man walks past a camera unnoticed. The lens captures his movement, his height, his stride, the outline of his face, but nothing about him triggers alarm. The footage is stored, overwritten, forgotten. Somewhere else, a neighbor waves politely. He takes out the trash. He holds the door. He looks like everyone else on the street. No one would think to ask where he was 10 years ago. No one would imagine what he once did after dark. And somewhere in a crowd, a stranger blends perfectly into the background. One face among hundreds. Unremarkable, forgettable, invisible by design. These killers were not legends. They were not myths. They didn't leave manifestos or signatures meant to be admired. They didn't seek fame. They didn't want to be remembered. They were real. They were careful. And they were never identified. That is the most frightening truth of all. Not that evil exists, but that it can be quiet, patient, and capable of stopping on its own terms. If these killers are still alive, they are not hiding in the shadows anymore. They are standing in lines. They are aging. They are passing time like everyone else. They are among us. And that is why these stories matter. Because the absence of answers is not the absence of danger. Because the cases that go quiet don't always mean justice was served. And because understanding how these killers disappeared may be the only way to recognize the next one before they do. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, question, or look twice, then this channel is for you. We tell the stories that don't end cleanly, the cases that refuse closure, the crimes that linger long after the headlines fade. Subscribe and stay with us, and don't forget to drop your comments on this. More disturbing investigations, more unresolved truths, more crime stories that don't let go. Because the next one may already be unfolding, and you won't want to miss it. If they're still alive, they are still among us.